Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Fitzsimmons, and this is Let's Talk. On this edition of Let's Talk, we're going to be chatting about the Washington State 3rd District Senate race upcoming with candidate Dave Lucas, and he joins us right now. Dave, welcome.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, a little background. Let's get up to speed as to who Dave Lucas is before we get into issues.
Fair enough, yeah. So I'm a husband, father, and community volunteer, but really, as we talk some of the issues about qualifications, is I really consider myself a servant leader. Spent about 22 years, almost 22 years in the Marine Corps, retired as a lieutenant colonel. So I've served our country both here in the United States as well as abroad in combat deployments, and really have recognized that I really enjoy serving others. And so even looking back and kind of reflecting on my childhood, whether it was being in Boy Scouts and serving our community, or all the way up through my time throughout the Marine Corps, really trying to help Marines excel and be successful, is really a joy for me. And so that's kind of who I am, I think, at the core level, is a servant leader.
And in terms of organizational backgrounds and what have you outside of your military involvement, what kind of things have you been doing?
So certainly in the community, I've been heavily involved in Boy Scouts. I have 2 young boys and have worked at all levels of scouting, from being a den leader at the Cub Scout level all the way to being the National Eagle Scout Association committee chair here and sitting on the council executive board. Also volunteered on several different veteran boards and worked with homeless veterans. I was one of the coordinators for the Veteran Stand Down last year, and also worked on the Homeless Connect for the greater Spokane area.
You are in the 3rd Legislative District, which has been almost exclusively, off and on, with few exceptions, Democrat.
It has been.
And you are a Republican. This is the home of Margaret Hurley, for example, a famous senator, a Democratic senator. You picked a pretty tough battle.
It is. It's been since 1992 that a Republican has been elected in the 3rd District. But I think one of the key points of that is the 3rd District has suffered under that. It's the poorest district in the state. It has the poorest zip code in the state. Many of the representatives have been in office for more than a decade, and we still see no improvement. They really aren't serving the people of the 3rd District. They're focused more on serving their party and what's important on the west side, which has really led to our one-party system that we see here in the state now. And so that's one of the things I think I really bring to this discussion, is someone who really is running to serve the people, not my own self-interests.
Indeed, the Democrats have viewed the 3rd District sort of as a gimme putt. You don't really have to work very hard to get the vote, and they haven't had to work very hard to get the vote. You're also up against the majority leader in the Senate, which is the top echelon player, so there's a lot at stake for that individual to retain his seat. You bit off an awful lot.
It certainly makes it exciting, and I think if you don't make bold changes without making bold actions, and so I think it was the right decision, and I think the people of the 3rd District really deserve better. And as I mentioned before, my background of standing up for the little guy, felt that was an opportunity to do that and speak on behalf of Spokane. I mean, they have voted for things, and I can go down the list, whether it was overwhelmingly for the $30 car tabs to have their licensing fees reduced, which could mean a lot to people. And my opponent, who, as you mentioned before, is the majority leader, could have ushered that through. Instead, has put roadblocks in front of that. Even now, he's the key person behind getting a special session going, and he has continued to drag his feet and has said things like, well, maybe after the election, and has alluded to the fact that he looks to bring new taxes on, which is one of the worst things we can do right now. The district is already suffering. People are already struggling. Businesses are closing. And then to look at, we're going to add additional taxes on people, it's just going to be disastrous. So I feel that I can come and I can help and stand up for the 3rd District, which the Democrats haven't done. They like to talk about it, but they haven't done it.
As you mentioned, of all 39 counties in the state of Washington, the 3rd District in Spokane County is the poorest district economically in the entire state.
Right.
And has been for a long time. I mean, there's been no improvement in that reality. And you have a lot of people, because of COVID-19 and because of the lockdown in the state and such, that are hurting badly in that district at the present time, and they're looking to the only entity that's available to them, government, to try to ease the pain. How will you do that?
Well, I think one of the things we need to do is not go after taxing them with additional taxes that are going to lead to more struggles, whether it's the property tax. Last week when I was out doorbelling, I talked to a lady who'd been in her house for 54 years. She was a 78-year-old widow and talked about how her property taxes have gone up the last 5 years. And I think most of our viewers would say that they've received their new assessments. You know, you get your property tax assessment, the two components of that, and then the added taxes, and she's worried. And she's not the only one as you talk to people. So going back and saying, which is the current proposal, that, you know, come the new year, we're going to go out and get new taxes, is what the mantra that you see being pushed, is not the right answer, not to mention businesses. If we start closing businesses, that means fewer jobs. Instead, what I would advocate is bringing more jobs and manufacturing back to Spokane. I mean, Hilliard's a perfect example. Had a proud manufacturing history, and that has fallen off. And instead of basically giving tax breaks to large organizations on the west side, let's bring those tax breaks to Spokane. Let's bring those opportunities to build up industry and bring good jobs into Spokane and give people an opportunity to work.
It has been a tradition in Spokane as well as across the country that small business is the backbone of local economies. In fact, somewhere between 7 and 8 out of every 10 positions that are available for hire will come from small businesses. And yet at the same time, small business seems to get the short end of the stick when it comes to the legislation that is entertained in Olympia. And they don't have a real champion.
They do not. And the B&O tax that we have in our state, the patchwork process of all these different taxations for different businesses and how close you are to this and that, has made it very difficult. One, it's made it difficult to do business because trying to figure that out and navigate through that. The other thing that businesses are really facing is the unemployment insurance. The Employment Security Division lost $500 million, $500 million approximately, of taxpayers' money that's going to have to be repaid. And right now the discussion is going after businesses to pay that and bring that, which again is wrong. There's certainly opportunity to take some of the federal CARES money, pay off some of that loss, and protect some of those businesses from this impending crisis of additional taxes and additional unemployment insurance that's going to cause them to close. And that is not what we want to be doing. We certainly don't want to close more businesses, put more people out of work. We need to do what we can to increase the economy and get things going.
Additionally, the labor and industries insurance policy in the state of Washington has been a thorn in the side of business, literally, for as long as I can remember, and I can remember back a long ways. So what do you do about that? People have been crying out for a solution there for a long, long time.
Well, and I think, I don't know if the listeners know, we're only one of 4 states that has a monopolistic state-run L&I program. So 46 of the other states have a commercial base where it's cheaper for the employees, it's a better program cheaper for the employers, and a better program for the employees. But yet we have basically built this huge state infrastructure, which we pay for, to run this. So one of the things I think we could certainly do is move away from that to a more open market process that we see in the other 46 states that seems to be much more efficient and costs a lot less.
Each of these issues we just touched upon have been issues that have been around a long time.
Yes.
Now let's fold COVID-19 over the process, right. Shut the state down, basically stab the hospitality industry between the shoulder blades,
right.
And then open, close, do all kinds of schizophrenic sorts of policies and setting expectations and then violating them and that sort of thing. I presume that you're not a real fan of the way Governor Inslee has handled this pandemic situation and the way in which it has affected your district.
No, not at all. In fact, I think initially, and as you learn from leadership and decision making, when things initially change, there may be some requirements to be very stringent with things, and we saw that. But as more information became available, we certainly could have made more small adjustments instead of these broad stroke decisions. The other piece is, I think businesses are the most innovative resource we have in our country. A small business is amazing. The things that they're able to do on a daily basis. If we had put out the large guidelines and put trust in the businesses, I think we would have seen a much better outcome, both from the COVID standpoint, but also keeping everybody safe, but also from the business standpoint, because they would have come up with creative and innovative ways to do that. We're seeing the same thing with the schools. We have this broad shutdown of schools instead of trying very creative solutions and reaching out and working both with the school districts, but also the other organizations that have worked in our community that have worked through some of these issues to try to figure out how we can get kids back to school safely and get the economy back up and running.
In the third district, you have businesses largely service-oriented. Large amount of that business has been hospitality for a number of years, restaurants, small motels, hotels, and that sort of thing. And a lot of those businesses have been service industries that folks use, HVAC operations, whatever. You don't have any Fortune 500s in there that have the ability to fight off this sort of a battle. There's only so much resource these businesses have before it gets to the point of no return and they shut down, which means not only do you lose a business entity and lose tax revenue, but you lose the jobs that were associated with it as well. Nobody, your opponent certainly hasn't suggested any way in which he would combat that process, that reality. Not at all. What would you do?
Well, I think one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, that we really need to be conscious of is supporting those businesses and keeping them alive. One of the things that I think is worth discussing is, do we suspend B&O taxes, which businesses obviously are very favorable to?
And folks don't necessarily understand. This is taxing $1, not profit $1.
Yes.
First dollar in the door gets taxed.
Right.
And all of them that come in.
It's on net versus what they, it's on,
on gross
versus
net.
net. Yes. So that's certainly one of the things that is very challenging for the businesses. So even if they aren't making a profit, they're still paying tax on that money that they're bringing in. So I think that's certainly one of the things we should be looking at, is what we can do to support them. As I mentioned before, the unemployment insurance issue is a huge issue as well, because if that's going to go up 200 or 300%, which is the potential discussion in the new year, that's just not sustainable for those businesses. Their profit margin is so thin, and that goes back to that patchwork of taxation, where you have some organizations and businesses that have a much higher profit margin might have a lower tax than a lower tax rate than some of the other businesses that might have a much closer profit margin, but a higher tax rate. So they're actually making a lot less money. So one of those things is we need to make sure that we're keeping those businesses afloat. And I think there are the resources available to do that. But certainly going into the new legislative session with the idea of new taxes on businesses, increasing the unemployment insurance, is just a catastrophe waiting to happen. And as you mentioned, the Fortune 500 businesses bringing to Spokane, I think that's an effort that should be made very aggressively. Spokane is an amazing community. People want to live in Spokane. Look at the housing market. People are coming to Spokane. We need to go out and advertise that to some of those large companies and show them the benefits of coming to Spokane and opening up and bringing back some of those great manufacturing traditions that Spokane used to have.
You touched upon property tax issues a moment ago, Dave. Let's go a little deeper into that. You mentioned the strong housing market at the present time. We have very few rentals available. The inventory is very small. The inventory of homes for sale is very small as well. Property values are going up, and the adjacent percentages of property values in terms of cost per $100,000 valuation is going up as well.
Both, yes.
At the same time, you have a large senior population in the third district whose income is not going up. It remains fixed. You mentioned the woman who's frightened about this. She isn't alone. There's all kinds of this going on. Retired individuals who have lived in their homes for a long, long time and are discovering that they may be taxed out of their homes, and that just seems grossly unfair.
It is. It's not. It's more than grossly unfair. It's not right. It's not what we are about in our country, and we need to come up with a plan that's going to ensure that those people are able to stay in their homes and enjoy their retirement in their homes. Obviously, as we talked about, there's the two avenues. You've got the assessment piece and you've got the taxation piece. And we certainly could address it on either side or a combination of the two. But I think we need to look at something that either caps, well, a cap of some manner, whether it's capping the assessment something like it's capped at what you buy your house for because you know what that property tax is, and it allows you to have some consistency. Or maybe it's in addressing the taxation rate and putting some type of a cap on that for people. But we certainly can't have this double jeopardy compounding factor that we're seeing. And the way things are looking now, 2021 is going to be awful for property owners because you're going to have this tsunami of tax increases and, as you mentioned, property rate increases from the assessments. And as I mentioned when we were looking at the assessment form earlier, most people's assessments have gone up. And there was an article recently that talked about how across the city, the different rates that had risen. And it's going to be a bad situation for people, and it's not right. We need to come up with a solution that will keep them in their homes and make it affordable, not this anxiety and stress of whether or not they're going to stay.
Even the renters. The third legislative district has a very high number of rental properties.
Yes.
And the current situation with respect to state law is that the landlords are not able to evict anyone who can't pay the rent. And I understand the social justice aspect of that. But they're never going to be able to pay the rent, which means that basically what we've told the landlords who are already hurting is, this is on you.
Right. And they are small business owners, no matter how you look at it. And the idea that the landlords are some evil organization trying to take advantage of everybody, we mentioned the prices and the property taxes going up. That adds to their costs, just like any other small business. And again, I think the state has an obligation to fill that gap, just like with the businesses, because this was state imposed. This wasn't something that happened due to economic changes in the economy. This was state driven, whether the businesses that were closed because of the state or now the landlords who don't have income coming in because of the state. The state has received a tremendous amount, billions of dollars in CARES money from the federal government that they still have available, and some of that should be used to fill that gap in those situations where the state has forced this struggle onto people. Needs to cover some of that because it wasn't a natural entity and it wasn't something that was done by anybody's actual actions. It was done by the state.
One of the concerns, however, is it was done by the executive branch of the state. The legislature had absolutely nothing to say about any of this process, never even attempted to have anything to say about this process. And it seems that is quite an oddity because we elected them to make the laws, but we have basically a governor who is making all the rules. And no one is attempting to challenge them. No one is representing their districts at this point.
No, it is completely unsatisfactory what's going on. And my opponent, obviously, is the majority leader, as I mentioned earlier, has failed in his responsibilities to lead the legislature. There has been no effort to bring that forward. And this impending budget crisis is to a certain extent self-imposed again by the state. The fiscal year started July 1st. If the legislature had met before July 1st and continued on the budget without acting and enacting these new taxation, these new increases, to include, as hypocritical as this is, a 3% pay raise for all of them, and the governor included. At the same time, they're laying people off. They're receiving a pay raise that they voted on. They had the opportunity to meet any time before then and just suspend all that and wait till January, which is a budget session anyways, and address it then. And the huge impending budget deficit, which gets kicked around somewhere between $8.8 and $9 billion, would have essentially been resolved. And then would have been able to take those, what the new reality between revenue and expenses, and adjust that in January, and not just kicked it down the current. As I mentioned earlier, my opponent has said, well, maybe after the election. It's not really fair to the voters to have to wait till after the election to find out what their representatives are going to do to them, particularly when it comes to these huge budget gaps that there's discussion that it's going to be additional taxation to fill those budget gaps.
Have you called him out on this?
Yes, but it's as the challenger there. I don't have necessarily a big bullpit, to be able to do that. So certainly have talked about it on my social media. I've done some videos. I've highlighted that. I've written. He and I have exchanged discussions on that, and he even responded and said my criticism of him on a failure to call the special session is a reasonable criticism. So there has been discussion. It makes it challenging. I talked about it a bit in my interview with the spokesman, but it certainly is something that that the legislature has failed to do, as you mentioned, has essentially ceded their responsibility to the government.
Forfeited it.
And have done nothing to work towards that. And there have been many legislators who have called out for a special session. So it's not that nobody has done it, but the people who have the ability to do that, because we're a democratic one-party system, each of the sides of the legislature and the governor are run by the Democratic Party. They've essentially colluded together to say, we're going to just kick it down the curb until after the election, and we're not going to address it.
Now, in terms of your view toward the future, let's assume that you get elected, which would be an upset of major proportions should it happen, and you know that.
I do, and a great opportunity, I think, for the people of the 3rd District to have somebody who will actually work for them, somebody who is as I mentioned, a servant leader and understands what service means, that it's not what I get out of it, it's what I can do for those people in the 3rd District.
These folks who have faithfully in the 3rd District voted Democratic are beginning to reassess, what do I get for my vote? I'm hearing that question asked a lot. They're basically looking at this saying, you assume that I will vote for you. What do I get? And they're discovering that when they ask that question, the answers are not very satisfactory.
Right. And I think that you're right in the fact of the assumption by the Democratic Party is that the 3rd District will go to them. I think there's also the assumption that they're going to win the governorship and that come the new year, they will still be a one-party system. And when January starts, the first bill out the door is going to be new taxation on people. And it is completely irresponsible and it is unnecessary. The state has the ability. There's plenty of revenue coming in. We have doubled the state budget in a decade. And so the revenue isn't an issue. The state has doubled the state budget in the last decade. And year after year, each time a budget negotiations come up, the first discussion in that, which is wrong, is the first discussion they start having is, what's the new tax we're going to put on people? And any economist will tell you that certainly in a downturn, that is not the time to add new taxes. All it does is further cause the depression to widen and further increase the issues that businesses are facing. So we need to look at what we can do with what we have and be smarter about the way we're spending the money, because there certainly is plenty of revenue. As I mentioned, if they had had a special session before July, we wouldn't even have the deficit. We would actually be about 3% ahead in revenue versus expenses based on what the economy was doing, even with the COVID shutdown.
I presume you're knocking on doors.
Knocking on doors, talking to people.
What are they telling you?
So people are concerned. There's a variety of different top issues as you talk to folks. Families are struggling. This school closure is making it very hard for them, both from a standpoint of work, but also as a completely new dynamic of teaching their kids. Most people, it's a new experience. You know, not everybody is technically savvy. And even more, the huge disservice to our community is the number of kids that aren't even dialing on. So we've got many kids across the district, and those are the kids that were really some of the most vulnerable kids. You know, the progressive continues to talk about, well, what are we doing to close the achievement gap? We're blowing the achievement gap up because the kids that needed the help the most are those that are still being left out. So families are concerned about schools. As we mentioned earlier, many of the seniors, as you talk to, are really concerned about their property taxes because they don't have any more income coming in. And there's no plan, and they don't see anybody talking about what are we doing to stop this unending greed for more taxation.
Do they seem to be aware that the Democrats have more or less ignored them or done this to them?
Yes and no. One of the challenges is people have become so party fixated. And the sad thing is, really at the state level, most of these issues are not partisan issues. Why is it a partisan issue to want to bring good jobs to Spokane? Why is it a partisan issue to keep people in their homes and not continue to drive them out with these additional taxation? I mean, the $30 car tabs is a perfect example. The 3rd District and the state overwhelmingly approved that initiative. And the legislature has failed numerous times to get that through. And this time, they actually blocked it in the sense of sending it to the courts instead of just implementing it and giving the people what they voted for. So they ask for something, they vote on it. The people speak, and the legislators go, I'm going to do something different. We don't really care what you said. I don't understand how that is even considered acceptable.
When you tell the folks that you visit door to door what you're about versus what they've been experiencing, do they get it?
They do. I mean, even folks who would say that they are a majoritively Democratic voter will say, you absolutely got my vote. Because I think people really recognize that they're not being represented. They haven't been represented in a while. And certainly things that are absolutely very clear, the $30 car tabs, the mandatory sex education for starting with kindergartners that my opponent sponsored and has been a proponent of with the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction to push this down on our children when a survey went out amongst parents, not Republican or Democrat, but amongst the school district, overwhelmingly said, no, we don't think this should be implemented for kindergartners. I have letters from school boards that basically talked about the fact that they didn't want it. And so basically stripping control, the only curriculum that the legislature decided they needed to strip control of and put in Olympia. But yet we have significant numbers of our graduates that can't pass the math and reading requirements from high school, but yet the number one issue that they want to take is the mandatory comprehensive sex ed starting with kindergartners. And so when you talk to the voters, they recognize that these things are things that they did not support, they were in opposition of, and the legislators that are there, their representatives that are supposed to represent them, the name of the word, represent us, they're not doing it.
But nobody asked them. Nobody ever asked the voters.
Right.
Nobody ever said, this is an idea we're thinking about. What do you think about? I mean, they've had a chance to go in front of local school boards and complain about it, and they have done that, but didn't do any good. They're going to do it anyway.
And they wrote letters to the governor to veto it. As I mentioned, the school districts wrote letters asking the governor to veto it. So yes, no, there's been a lot of outcry. And I mean, I think as you look at R90, referendum 90, to repeal that bill is a perfect example of how impactful that is. A referendum requires 129,000. They got 266,000 in a short period under COVID in a lockdown with no paid signature gatherers, no ability to go to Mariners games or anything like that. And overwhelmingly more than double that in a short time period because people were just appalled at this. They went over, they testified, the committee said thanks, and they still pushed it through.
But that by itself is a perfect example of the fact that the democratically controlled Senate and House in Olympia are paying no attention to you.
Yes. They are not. They are not representing the people.
Right.
They are representing their
time
party.
that we have left. You've bitten off a big battle, no question
Yes.
about that, and you know that, okay? And you know that this is going to be a David and Goliath kind of a ball game. How are you going to win it?
We're going to win it on the issues and principles. My opponent has not supported the people. He has not stood up for them. He is routinely, as we've gone through in this interview, whether it was the $30 car tabs, the mandatory sex education, taxation, the advisory votes, they voted against all this taxation and they still pushed it through. So the people know they are not being represented. The real question is whether they are willing to say, I know I'm not being represented, but I'm going to vote not partisan. I'm going to vote for a person of character, a person who's going to stand up for them and who's going to do the right thing no matter what. That's what I've spent my life doing, standing up for people, standing up for other countries, standing up for our country, and I will continue to do that for the 3rd District. So it's a challenging race, and I am going to continue to talk to people and let them know that if they elect me, they will have somebody who will fight for them tirelessly in their corner and will stand up for them and serve them, not be served.
How can individuals who are interested in your campaign and want to find out more, how do they contact you? How do they participate? We have just a little over a month before the election as this conversation is being recorded. But the reality of it is that there are a lot of folks who want change.
A lot of folks do want change, and the opportunity to reach out to me is you can go to my website at www.votedavelucas.net. You can certainly go to my Facebook page, which is the same, Vote Dave Lucas, or you can give me a call, good old-fashioned phone, 509-540-3283, and I'll talk to you about it, and we can talk. Or happy to set up a Zoom call if somebody would like to do that. I know there's some people that are concerned about that, or as I mentioned, a phone call. But again, I really need your vote. I will stand up for the 3rd District. And again, I am a person of high character and integrity. My history shows that, and I will be one who will fight tirelessly for the people of the 3rd District, not for a party over politics, a party over people, or politics over people, which is what we're seeing now, but put the people first. The people that elect me will be my number one priority in every decision I make.
We thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Mike.
He is Dave Lucas, and he is running for the Washington State Senate in the 3rd Legislative District. And that's this edition of Let's Talk. I'm Mike Fitzsimmons. Thanks for watching.